Thank you all for joining. My name is Wissam. I'm the social media manager for CJPME. I'll be the host for this session. Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East is an advocacy organization that promotes justice, development, and peace in the Middle East and Canada. Our activities include community outreach, media advocacy, policy work, and awareness campaigns. You can follow us on all social media accounts under the name of CJPME or sometimes CJPME Official. I think on TikTok and Instagram it's CJPME Official. On the rest, it's CJPME. Today's session is titled How Three Loopholes Allow Canada to Arm Israel's Genocide. It'll be presented by our Senior Director of Strategy and Parliamentary Affairs, Alex Paterson. A brief introduction before I pass it on to Alex. In March 18th, 2024, Parliament voted for an Opposition Day motion brought forward by the NDP that included a call to end armed transfers to Israel. While this motion passed, it was non-binding and the Liberal government failed to uphold the commitments it made in negotiations with the NDP and NCCM. Despite repeated statements and assurances that Canada is not sending weapons to Israel from both the previous and current Liberal government, evidence emerged from US disclosures and a Project Ploughshares report that Canadian arms are in fact reaching Israel through a long-standing US loophole that was created during the Cold War and was never closed. This loophole enables Canadian weapons and components to flow to Israel via the US, bypassing Canadian oversight and reporting. These transfers put Canada in clear violation of both domestic and international law, particularly given that Canada is a signatory to the Arms Trade Treaty, which prohibits arms exports that are used in human rights abuses. One small thing before I pass it on to Alex, I will be monitoring questions as they appear in the Q&A box. You can see it there. I'll reply to what I can, but we have assigned several segments during the presentation where we will be answering questions. And on to Alex Paterson, who will take us through the details of this loophole and the NDP Jenny Kwan's private members bill on the No More Loopholes Act that will be introduced this September. Thank you, Alex, and thanks everyone for being with us.
Thanks, Wissam, for getting us started, and thanks everyone for attending here today. So we're here today to talk about the No More Loopholes Act. As Wissam said, back on March 18th, 2024, Parliament voted for an Opposition Day motion brought forward by the NDP that included a call to end arms transfers to Israel. Unfortunately, as Wissam said, this motion was non-binding, and the Liberals did not live up to the agreements they made with the NDP and the NCCM to arrive at the final text. Learning from this experience, the Arms Embargo Now coalition, wanted to find something binding that was within the powers of MPs rather than ministers to fight for that would end Canadian complicity in the genocide. CJPME set to work on identifying the policy levers that would allow this, and our only options were a government bill or a private member's bill. After we identified the policy play we went in search of a supportive MP who would work with us to develop a private member's bill. We did try to get Liberals, but none of them were up for it after the election of Mark Carney. That said, the No More Loopholes Act is being introduced in the House of Commons this September because CJPME and our allies in Arms Embargo Now asked Jenny Kwan to work with us to close the loopholes that allow Canadian arms to still flow to Israel. We sent MP Kwan's office an instruction brief describing the best legislation we could imagine to stop Canadian-made arms from reaching Israel as it conducts its genocide in Gaza, and then we worked with Jenny Kwan's office in the Legislative Drafting Unit of the House of Commons to draft this bill to address the core reasons that Canada is still claiming it's able to arm Israel. Let's get a bit into the background of this bill. As was mentioned before, this bill aims to make Canada's domestic laws more like the Arms Trade Treaty that Wissam mentioned. The Arms Trade Treaty is a multilateral convention ratified by the United Nations General Assembly in 2013, and it came into force globally in 2014. Canada officially became a state party of the Arms Trade Treaty in June 2019. While both Israel and the US have signed the treaty, Neither are actually state parties to the treaty because they have not ratified it nor turned it into domestic legislation like Canada has. To bring the treaty into force domestically, Canada amended the Export and Import Permits Act to harmonize our export laws with that newly signed Armed Trades Treaty. This overhaul did, in fact, improve Canada's arms control regime from what it was before. Unfortunately, Canada's harmonization process was undermined by omitting critical articles from the Arms Trade Treaty. This is not unlike how Canada has attempted to water down the domestic adoption of other important global conventions. An example that comes to mind for me is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So, back in 2020, 2021, thereabouts, Canada's arms control regime was found to have failed in preventing Canadian parts from being diverted by Turkey to Azerbaijan by a study of Canada's Foreign Affairs Committee of the House of Commons. In particular, the committee noted that Canada has a very narrow view of risk when conducting human rights assessments of weapons transfers. During the study, civil society in particular identified how Canada uses loopholes to sneak weapons to its perceived allies, often putting politics ahead of international legal obligations. Sounds familiar? Now, the substance of the No More Loopholes Act itself. If I were to summarize the three critical problems that we're trying to address with Canada's current weapons exports laws, it comes down to this. Canada has a whole bunch of decent rules built into the legislation, but Canada exempts the US from all of them in its regulations. The US just simply gets a free pass from any scrutiny. Two, Canada does not scrutinize parts the way it does a full weapon system. So that means it doesn't look at the tank barrel the same way it looks at a tank. Canada allows the minister to approve transfers on what essentially amounts to a pinky swear from other countries that they won't do bad things with it. So that's it in a nutshell, the problems with the legislation, but we'll dive deeper. Now, let's make these loopholes a bit more practical and understand the context a little better. To do that, let's do a brief study of Canada's F-35 program. As we're all likely to be aware by now, the F-35 is being used by Israel in horrendous ways to bombard Gaza daily. And as many of you may be aware, the F-35 would not fly without Canadian components or parts. In total, there are roughly 22 Canadian-made components listed on Lockheed Martin's website before it was scrubbed when we started, along with Arms Embargo Now, turning the public gaze onto them. They scrubbed it from the website. The majority of the components are sent to the US and then assembled into a completed F-35. That said, we also provide replacement parts for worn out or damaged parts. We provide testing equipment directly to Israel that is made to be used with the F-35. In a nutshell, Canada could bleed Israel dry if we refuse to export to them. Israel's squadron would be grounded without our parts, components, and testing equipment. That's one of the interesting realities of a globally integrated supply chain and the industrial projects surrounding the F-35. We as Canada can be a global choke point for the F-35. On July 29th, the Arms Embargo Now Coalition released an extremely revealing report, led by the work of the Palestinian Youth Movement and World Beyond War. The report focused on Canada's ongoing direct shipments to Israel. The report documented that critical F-35 parts were being sent to Israel's largest arms company, the notorious Elbit Systems. Those were going directly from Canada. The report additionally identified three key suppliers of F-35 parts in Canada. Nexia Canada, the testing equipment, CMC Electronics, navigation equipment, and Stelia Aerospace, North America, which actually provides parts of the fuselage or airframe. In particular, AEN found that Nova Scotia-based Stelia Aerospace did send 3 shipments, actually made 6 documented shipments of critical F-35 fighter jet components directly to Elbit Systems Cyclone Division. They identified one shipment in November 2023 that was aircraft parts, 5 shipments labeled military aircraft parts between March and September 2024. And these shipments were transported on commercial Air Canada flights through Frankfurt, Paris to Tel Aviv. So the Elbit Cyclone facilities are in the Carmel Israeli Air Force Base, and that's where F-35s get a lot of their maintenance. In particular, the composite fuselage panels are essential components that maintain the F-35 stealth capabilities, enabling Israel to conduct undetected bombing operations across the region. So, this is a good example of a Canadian part that is essential to the F-35's operability. So back in January 2025, Project Ploughshares released a report documenting the Canadian parts and components were used in every production run of F-35s to date. A production run is when you develop a certain number of aircraft in a given time, and then that batch of aircraft is then sent out, and then a new batch is started. And sometimes there might be different configurations between a particular production run, but the point is to say that Canadian parts have been involved in every version of the F-35 from when F-35s began up until today. Canada is the 6th largest global financial beneficiary of the F-35 project. There has never been a run of F-35s that has flown without Canadian parts. So let's take those two pieces of information and put them together, those loopholes and our information about the F-35. So loophole number 1, the US exemption. Canada does not have to report F-35 parts or any other weapons sent to the US because of a specific clause in our regulations that exempts the US from all other arms controls associated with this document called the Export Control List. We also have another mechanism that allows bullet makers to send bullets freely to the US without any review of their use, whether they will be sent to Israel for use in Gaza or put on the market to be used in school shootings or other civil violence in the United States. This mechanism is called a general permit. It allows all companies to send as many bullets as they can without having to get approval. The really dangerous thing is there's nothing in our laws that prevents Canada from making these types of exceptions for other countries, whether they're good or bad. Similarly, Canada could just approve a general permit for any type of weapon or part at any time. These provisions are disasters waiting to happen. It's a way that Canada downloads its responsibility for arms control to the US. So, the solution. To properly regulate the flow of, say, F-35 parts, we need to cancel the US's free pass in our arms control laws. This is achieved in 2 ways by the No More Loopholes Act. It bans country exemptions for weapons exports specifically, and it bans the use of general export permits for any type of weapon. These proposed changes would end US favoritism in our laws and ensure all countries are treated fairly by our laws. It would also remove the possibility of another exemption for a different country being created in the future. So, loophole number 2. Currently, Canada has not adopted Article 4 of the Arms Trade Treaty. This portion of the ATT explicitly says that risk assessments must treat weapons parts that can be assembled into a full weapon as if they were the full weapon. So, a wing of an F-35, a navigation system component, or a sensor must be treated like the full F-35 when assessing the risk of sending it to Israel, Azerbaijan, Iran, Russia, the US. Canada has over 20 suppliers that are sending parts and components to be included in production runs of F-35s or used as replacement parts. Canada is sending parts directly to Israel and indirectly through the US loophole. Similarly, if we are unclear if the F-35 parts sent to other F-35 partners also might end up in Israel. We're not conducting the required analysis of those parts to make sure that they are going where they're supposed to and they're not used in human rights violations. So, the solution. To properly regulate the flow of F-35 parts to Israel, the No More Loopholes Act adds the missing language from the Arms Trade Treaty. This means when conducting a risk assessment of sending a component to Israel or the US or any other country, global affairs would need to treat the part as if it were the full weapons system. So, the third and final loophole that is a major problem in the Export Import Permits Act is that the minister can choose to arm a genocide. And that's because Canada has never adopted Article 6 of the Arms Trade Treaty. This article specifically bans or prohibits any transfer of weapon or parts covered if it has knowledge at the time of the authorization that the arms or items would be used in the commission of genocide, crimes against humanity, grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions of 1949, attacks directed against civilian objects or civilians protected as such, or other war crimes as defined by international agreements to which it is a party. So, summing all of that up, in other words, if Canada knows Israel will use F-35s to kill civilians or destroy hospitals, it is required to not ship F-35 parts under Article 6.3 of the Arms Trade Treaty. If Canada knows that any of our weapons or parts will be used to impose the apartheid system, it would not be able to ship them. Instead of prohibiting transfers like Article 6, instead of prohibiting transfers to countries where there are obvious serious risks that those weapons will be used in grave violations of international law, Canada instead allows the Minister of Foreign Affairs to decide whether they can mitigate the risk with things called end-use assurances or other types of mitigating measures. In a nutshell, Canada's laws allow for the minister to decide if they feel it is in Canada's interest to send arms despite significant and grave risks of human rights violations and war crimes. Canada's system relies on a pinky swear from leaders like Netanyahu that Canadian weapons will not be used in the commission of war crimes. This is a loophole that allows Canada to put alliance politics above global human rights and international law obligations. So, the solution. The No More Loopholes Act outright bans the transfer of arms in situations where Canada knows they will be used in war crimes by making this one of the purposes of Canada's Export and Import Permits Act. In Jenny Kwan's PMB, the language from Article 6 of the Arms Trade Treaty is added to the purposes section of our Export and Import Permits Act. That means that the minister would be required to ensure that Canadian-made F-35 parts are not used in serious war crimes. It's not up to their discretion anymore. It would be their duty, according to the No More Loopholes Act. So at this point, it's a really good time to take questions specifically about the content that we've covered so far, the Arms Trade Treaty, and the No More Loopholes Act. Wissam, do we have any questions?
I do have one question, but just to confirm it, I'll ask you to go through it again. Somebody was asking, so how are the F-35 fighter jet parts from Canadian manufacturer? And are they delivered to Israel, transported via Air Canada to Paris or Frankfurt, then on to Tel Aviv? And where is the USA link and loophole? I did type out a reply, but perhaps you can clarify.
Yeah, the clarification is that Jenny Kwan's No More Loopholes Act that we help her write is addressing 3 loopholes. So in the case of those Stelia North America shipments, it's not addressing the US loophole, but instead it's the other 2 loopholes. The parts aren't treated like full weapon systems, and the ministerial discretion loopholes that we think more applies in those cases. But there will be new case studies of the U.S. loophole that are going to be coming in October that will apply more directly.
Did Canada explicitly state that it was not adopting Article 4 of the ATT, or did it just fail to implement Article 4 when it acceded to the ATT?
Yeah, so the way it worked was that when Canada signed on, they in 2019 they added new language to the Export and Import Permits Act, but they didn't add all of the necessary language. I wasn't around at the time, so I don't have knowledge of the way that the conversations went. But the end result of that process was that Article 4 and Article 6 never made it into Canada's domestic law. And by our analysis, are one of the main contributing factors to why there still are arms transfers like this that end up in conflict situations where it's kind of reprehensible that we're arming them.
No, two more actually. Are there examples of countries that have adopted the ATT and not excluded Articles number 4 and number 6?
I don't know.
If Canada has these loopholes in the law, have Canadian officials violated existing Canadian laws with arming Israel?
I mean, the situation is that for us and our allies, we believe that Canada has already violated already existing laws, but Canada is acting like it hasn't. So we're forced into a situation where we're trying to box them in by changing the laws and making it more and more clear that the status quo policy is unacceptable. So in an ideal world, James Yap and Canadian Lawyers for International Human Rights will win its court case saying that Canada violated the already existing laws when it sent arms to Israel, but that court case could take years. So we're also trying to do this legislative effort to kind of tie the hands of the Canadian government to stop future transfers to Israel, both directly and through the U.S.
Okay. Since these three loopholes are so substantial, how is it that the Liberal government could assert that there would be no further weapons sent to Israel? What aspect of these loopholes got analyzed in Parliament when the government's measure was debated and passed?
I would say that none of these loopholes were substantively debated or examined in the House in the lead up to the March 18th vote, nor were they studied that day. So I think the one shout out that we can give is that Heather McPherson did try to subpoena documents from the government related to Canada's arms transfers to Israel. And I myself have tried to ATIP the risk assessments that they've used, but have been continually denied access to those documents or slow walk into getting them. So I think the issue here is that we haven't had proper examination of this. And rather than the government being proactive, it's been up to civil society to push for this, and then for a small opposition party to decide to do what's right to address the kind of like gaping holes that the government has left.
Amazing. Thanks a lot, everybody, for the questions. Keep them coming. Has the UN called out Canada on this? It has done for Indigenous people.
I think there were some strong statements made. I can't remember the exact name of the committee, but James Yap, the Canadian lawyer, again did a long submission to, I believe, like something like the status of women committee at the UN, and they made some pretty strong critical statements against Canada. And I know that the special rapporteur for the occupied Palestinian territories has also, Francesca Albanese has also made mention of Canada's arming of Israel as well. I'm not sure of additional call-outs that Canada may have received.
There was a question about Canadian manufacturers that produce F-35 parts if they produce non-military products and if they're at risk of losing jobs.
So a lot of suppliers of F-35 parts are kind of like multidisciplinary companies. So they could easily convert their lines to build something else. So an example is like Magellan Aerospace. It is involved in the civilian aviation field, not just the military aviation field. And I do believe in Canadian workers' ingenuity to easily transition to working for companies or to easily transition their lines that they're already working in to civilian applications.
We take
And,
the last
and
one.
and I'll also say that we're not pushing for like with this bill for there to be no war industry or no defense industry. What we're saying is that these parts can still be created, but in assessing whether or not they should arrive at a specific destination, that the human rights risk assessment must be fulsome and take into consideration these additional principles that we're missing from the Arms Trade Treaty. We have to remember that the Arms Trade Treaty explicitly says that it's a right of states to develop their infrastructure of self-defense. So a good example is like we do think that Canada would still get permits for the export of goods to Ukraine. I don't think that that is prohibited under this legislation. The thing that is prohibited is arming grave breaches of international law and war crimes. So that's only specific actors that are systemically engaged in that type of behavior, not all armies necessarily.
And which specific existing Canadian laws does CJPME consider that government officials have violated by arming Israel?
This same act that we're talking about, the Export and Import Permits Act, in particular, already has the weaker human rights assessments that I've explained, and it has always been our position that we think that Canadian law was violated by arming Israel already. But as I said, that given the government's claims that it hasn't, we've decided to move forward in pushing for this legislation to kind of make that point and let the truth be seen, as it were.
Amazing. That's it from our end.
Perfect. So at this point, um, that is actually the core three loopholes and the things that Jenny Kwan's bill was supposed to address. You now know the basics of the No More Loopholes Act we are dealing with. Everything from here forward is more of an advanced training on communications. So if you don't want extra details to complicate matters, it's okay to stop here. The content we have left to cover is all about some suggestions for effective communication with Liberal politicians about why they should support this bill. For this bill to pass, we need the vast majority of the Liberal caucus to vote for it. So the rest of the webinar, we are focused on persuading Liberal MPs, their staff, and their backers to support this bill. I just wanted to flag for everyone that on Wednesday night, there is another webinar hosted by Arms Embargo Now that will cover strategy and tactics for pressuring your MP. This is important if you have an MP who is not open to conversation. The skills in both webinars are complementary, but what we're going to focus on in this webinar is engaging in conversation with an MP who's willing to talk, or a staffer who's willing to talk, or like a key volunteer for an MP who actually wants to talk about the issue. So with that said, to advocate for this bill effectively in lobby meetings with MPs, we need to ensure we share some core assumptions about communicating directly with Liberal MPs. Again, just remembering that I said this is for kind of more collaborative, non-oppositional MP meetings. I might give very different advice if we were talking about a pressure campaign or an oppositional meeting. So identity is formed by stories we tell ourselves and our communities. We're going to be speaking to people who may not share all of our core beliefs or stories. We will not change someone's overall worldview overnight. A liberal nationalist is unlikely to become a third worldist opponent of settler colonialism in a single conversation. When lobbying, our goal is to engage already existing stories to our advantage, so both moral and identity-based stories. We're trying to shift people to our story while not attacking their core story directly. The goal is to get them to support the bill, not necessarily become a diehard anti-Zionist after your conversation. We are trying to activate inherent, unconscious morality that is based on the liberal progressive story that the state is responsible for protecting innocent civilians. So, and this is where I'm getting a little deeper, a little more academic. Totally okay to start shooting questions about this into the Q&A, and we will pick them up at the end. During the so-called War on Terror, Canadian politicians appealed to three core identity stories or discourses to debate Canada's potential engagement in the invasions and occupations of Afghanistan and Iraq. These stories can be used to both help or hinder our campaign goals, and understanding how to mobilize them or neutralize them is one of the most important skills one can develop in lobbying or political campaigning. The first story used in the so-called War on Terror was the narrative of Canada as America's neighbor, and this is based on strong cultural links. This story was based on the idea that Canada must be a reliable ally to its partners. This story is one we have to neutralize since Canada is allies with the US and their genocidal proxy, Israel. The second story mobilized was that Canada is the protector of foreign civilians. Think of the narrative around Canada needing to defeat the Taliban to protect women and girls. This unfortunate story was mobilized as a tool of imperialism. Lastly, there's the story of Canada as one of the champions of multilateralism and international law, and all of the associated global institutions like the United Nations and the World Trade Organization. This story is one of the most useful to us. So let's dive a bit deeper into those stories. As I said, the most important story for supporting the bill is the narrative of Canada as a champion of multilateralism. This story of Canadian identity focuses on Canadians playing a founding role in the United Nations and other important global institutions that serve as the forum for international law and trade. A key symbol or image of this story is of Canadian soldiers in blue helmets defending others. It is Canadians as peacekeepers. Remember, when talking about these stories, they don't actually have to be true to have power and discussion. An aspect of the whole truth can be mythologized into the full story. You don't need to fully believe these stories to use them symbolically and strategically. But it's important to remember that there is continuity in the story of Canada as a founding member of the UN and a founding member of peacekeeping, and the Arms Trade Treaty being a vital contemporary UN convention that Canada has signed and become a state party to. It can be shown as a mechanism that is reflective of Canada's attachment to the UN system and the principles that it represents nationally and globally. We need to emphasize the continuity between supporting the Arms Trade Treaty and this pillar of Canadian identity. Secondly, stories of Canadian identity can be used against us and our cause for Palestinian liberation. Stories are always contested ground because meaning has to be continually remade. Myths sustained through each historical moment. So, for example, by positioning IDF soldiers as hostages rather than prisoners of war, Israel and its allies have been subconsciously tapping into the story of Canadians as the defenders of innocent civilians. When pro-Israel supporters retell the story of October 7th, they lump civilian and military deaths together. They do this to tap into our subconscious understanding of Jewish people as the pure innocent victims of irrational brutality and violence. This story comes from our cultural narrative of the real savagery of the Holocaust. that barbarity was real, and its echoes can be mobilized morally in political conflict today. Within Canadian mythology, we have a duty to defend innocent victims of political violence. Pro-Israel groups mobilize this story in a manner that has their narrative start on October 7th rather than with the over 75 years of military occupation of Palestine and the attendant land theft and ethnic cleansing. The pro-Israel narrative is effective because it continually asserts victimhood, displaces blame on the Palestinians, painting them as the violent new Nazis, and then calls for Canadian protection. Now, I'm outlining their narrative, I'm not validating it. But let's be frank, it's a masterclass in narrative framing. They have shifted soldiers who enforce a brutal illegal occupation into victims. The facts of a violent occupation and apartheid system do not matter when their pro-Israel story is so emotionally compelling to some Canadians. Now, for our side, when advocating for this bill, we must ensure we discuss the human cost of Israel's genocide and the moral danger in continuing to arm it vis-a-vis the existing EPA loopholes. We need to demonstrate to MPs the extensive nature of damage and the social cost of the Israeli ethnic cleansing operations. We have to show them the scale of devastation and personal stories associated with it. We need to both humanize individual Palestinians to overcome anti-Palestinian racism, but also emphasize the overwhelming scale of the genocide. Doing this will trigger the Canadian identity story of the responsibility to protect and humanitarian intervention. That said, it's always important to emphasize that sending aid is not sufficient when Canadian arms are flowing to Israel. The reason that I'm emphasizing the scale of damage is that recently the Israeli Foreign Affairs Ministry partnered with an APAC adjacent pollster in the US to run a massive mixed methods study into perceptions of Israel across North America and Europe. The results were leaked to Dropsite News. What was found is that in countries where people believe both that the death toll is higher and the percentage of civilian deaths is higher, those countries were more significantly supportive of Palestinians and therefore sanctions against Israel. It might seem simple, but it was exhaustive proof that both humanizing Palestinians and showing the cost to civilians is our strongest rhetorical weapon in defeating the institutional inertia preventing action against Israel's genocide. So finding creative ways to show this to your MP will be crucial in winning this campaign. Israel is investing so much in response to this because this is where they are most vulnerable. And this is why they use their strategy of atrocity propaganda. Now, the last discourse. The story of Canada as the reliable ally is where we are in the most danger simply because Canada is not an ally of Palestinians and lists almost all Palestinian political parties as terrorist organizations. Instead, Canada has a military and security alliance with Israel along with a free trade agreement. Secondly, Israel's major patron is the US, our closest and most important military ally that happens to be the strongest country in the world. This asymmetrical relationship structures everything about Canada's decision-making and, quite frankly, our very identity. Canada's foreign policy is shaped by the US's Middle East peace process and security paradigm. At best, we want to neutralize this argument and shift back to discussing the other two stories where we are stronger. It's important to understand this one as a core counter-argument that will likely be used against us. So that's part one of the recipes for moving on. The second part here is political context. Since the election of Donald Trump and the last federal election here in Canada shepherding Carney into power, the Canadian political terrain has significantly shifted. The political context we knew under Trudeau and Biden is simply long gone and requires new communications. When Trudeau and Biden were leaders of North America, there was significant alignment and limited friction between the US and Canada. Biden, though pro-Israel, did place minor limitations on Israel. With the election of Trump, after an initial ceasefire, Israel has been unhinged and left to break every norm that holds global peace and security together. The attempted assassinations in Qatar, the latest example of this pattern. Additionally, there is massive strain on the Canada-US relationship, making Canadians far less likely to be concerned with supporting US positions. This conflict presents us with an opportunity to neutralize the reliable ally discourse with the US. We can change the story. So, a little bit of a big word alert, but let's not get too caught up with it. With Carney's ascension to the leadership of the Liberal Party and assumption of the prime ministership, Canada has pivoted to increase military spending and industrial development as a pillar of Carney's economic strategy. The Carney Doctrine is decidedly pro-military development and spending. Additionally, Canadian foreign policy is currently focused on arming Ukraine to defeat Russia. We need to assure Liberal MPs that this bill does not affect Canada's support for Ukraine. Our message needs to thread the needle in a way that avoids challenging the core of Carney's agenda if we want this bill to pass. We do not want the Prime Minister's office putting the screws to MPs to oppose this bill. Instead, arguments that validate the government agenda and position aligning with the Arms Trade Treaty as complementary of the wider Carney vision are optimal for our campaign. Okay, so as I said, in this advanced training, I may have added a lot of mind clutter to consider, but it can be distilled and it can be used. I've shared a lot of information with you. You might feel a bit overwhelmed, and that's okay. I'm doing a quick crash course in developing a narrative framing. Not all of it's going to stick, but over time, you should get really comfortable with it. The important thing to remember is that we need to tell a story that gives the basic facts meaning. So we're going to start here with straplines. Straplines are summarizing your campaign in a few words that should be memorable and convey values. They're often used as titles or punchlines. This is an example of a possible strapline for this campaign. Think of a strapline almost like a motto or a catchphrase. You might say it 3 to 5 times in a meeting with an MP, hoping to lodge it into their subconscious. So based on what I've shared before, this is a strapline I came up with. It's not been workshopped. It's not the strapline that we're going to come up with, but it's an example of one that we could use. Canadian values, no loopholes, no exceptions. So if you want, you can share some other possible straplines in the chat. I think the chat's active. If it's not, feel free to share possible straplines in the Q&A. So an example from the last election of a strapline was Poilievre's axe the tax, and a whole bunch of the other catchphrases that he used and were kind of like indicative of his communication strategy. CJ and others from the pro-Israel crew have used Bring Them Home as their strapline since October 7th. Next, we have campaign one-liners. This is essentially a rhetorical flourish you are building everything you say around. It's the moral proposition you are offering in a single sentence. We're trying to summarize what we are trying to convey into a single sentence that shares our moral outlook and the story we are trying to tell. Again, much like the strapline, we're going for unforgettable. So in this case, again, unworkshopped, Canadian support for international law shouldn't have a loophole for Israel's genocide nor Trump's complicity. That's an example of a one-liner that we could use in our communications. Feel free to, once again, share your possible one-liners with others in the chat or Q&A. Now, this is one example of how we could take everything that we talked about in this webinar so far and turn it into a summary paragraph. This is a core message paragraph. This is where you're trying to summarize our narrative in one shot that can be used in emails or conveyed to a politician in 1 minute or conveyed to the media in a very short interview. In general, we want to be able to summarize our core position into a single paragraph that hits the keynotes in our story or narrative framing and the political context discussion. So my example that I came up with was, as Canadians, we built the UN system on which international law and trade is now based. We built this system to protect our shared values and the interests with our allies. Canadian support for international law shouldn't have a giant loopholes for Israel's genocide nor Trump's complicity. That's why we need to ensure Canada finally fully adopts the Arms Trade Treaty and eliminates all the remaining loopholes that allow weapons to be snuck to Israel to fuel their endless assault to Palestinian civilians. Anything less undermines our values and our security. So that's one possibility for a core message paragraph. As you progress, coming up with your own, you'll nail it. So those are core messages, but there are scaffolding or pillars that are required to support the core message. And those should be as punchy and hard to forget arguments as the core message. So some examples are Canada's current arms control regime has so many loopholes, it's like a brick of Swiss cheese. We need to cancel the US's free pass and end favoritism in our weapons export laws. If it could be assembled into a full weapon system, it's a weapon, period. We cannot rely on pinky swears as the basis of our arms control regime. Implement a one company, one type of weapon, one permit principle. Israel's assault on Gaza has slaughtered over 64,000 people, with some early models predicting over 184,000 deaths associated with the genocide. Now, you might be questioning my use of imagery like Swiss cheese or pinky swears and wondering if it's professional or appropriate. Part of narrative framing is referring to imagery that people can relate to and imagine as mental pictures. These are not rhetorical devices to avoid. Instead, imagery is essential to conveying meaning. We're charting a course through an already existing mental map that is composed of moral landmarks, and that's what those images are. I see the hand, but we are on the second last slide, so we're going to have lots of time for questions coming up. So what can you do with all of this information that I have dispensed? Right away, if you haven't already, you can sign our petition and email your MP to support the No More Loopholes Act if you haven't already. Once you've done this, you can schedule your first meeting with your MP to discuss the No More Loopholes Act. If you want support in that meeting, you can join the CJPME Lobby Corps on our website, and we provide further training and coaching to make sure that everyone feels comfortable talking to their MP. And if push comes to shove, we can try and send a buddy or mentor with you. Thank you so much, everyone, for sticking with us through what we know was a lot of content. At this time, the floor is open to ask questions about everything we have covered today. So it can be, again, more questions about the nuts and bolts of the No More Loopholes Act, or it can be from the content on narrative framing.
I put the link for the campaign. Somebody has asked for it, and I'll do the petition in a minute. We do have a couple of questions. Will the bill outlaw sending components to Israel that can be used for defensive purposes, such as the Iron Dome?
So I don't think so. And the reason is that I don't think the Iron Dome is being used in a grave breach of international law. But I could be wrong. Like, I think someone could make the argument that it facilitates other war crimes, or that it facilitates the apartheid system, but I'm not sure how strong that argument would be legally.
Why the double standards with regards to Ukraine? Canada must not have any regime which systematically commits war crimes, regardless of whether it's is us US claimed as an ally or now.
Um, I mean, if there are systemic documentation of Ukrainian war crimes, then I think that it's something that the loophole fixes would cover. But I've been focused on war crimes committed by Israel in Gaza, and I have not systemically studied what's going on in Ukraine and Russia. So, like, if they've committed systemic war crimes, then it would be covered.
Okay, I do have one last question, primarily. Another one came in. My MP is conservative. Briefly, any changes to our approach or other recommendations?
So, I think emphasizing defending civilians and Canada's multilateral history still stands. The thing that does seem to motivate conservatives more is like an even more steadfast um, belief that Canada needs to be a reliable partner to Israel. And I'm not sure to whether with conservatives at this point, given Polyev and Lanceman are leaders, whether that can be subverted. But I would at least want to try by using the two other arguments and get feedback from you on whether that's landing. I think one other argument that does work with conservatives is the need for transparency and public disclosure. Transparency and people's right to know is not just a progressive principle; it is like a core principle to uh, conservative values as well. So I would lean on that as well.
Okay, I have a couple more questions, but there is a hand up. If you can type your question in the Q&A, please. Um, I'll not say your name, but maybe they can see it. I don't know. Anyways, the person who has his hand up, type the question. Is the Arms Trade Treaty recognized by the International Court of Justice? If so, how does the court recognize national exemptions as acceptable?
I mean, the International Court of Justice would recognize um, the treaty as having standing like other international law, but I'm not qualified to say whether the International Court of Justice could adjudicate on the Arms Trade Treaty or not at this time. I'm sorry, that's a bit of a cop-out answer, but I don't know.
These loopholes exist precisely because I think, oh yeah, because Canadian government wants them regardless of war crimes. What is the next step after the government either rejects the bill or simply lies about upholding it like the past 2 years?
Yeah, so this private members bill is the first salvo in what will be, I think, a long campaign to further change Canada's um, weapons control laws. So just going back to the basics, like the first change to these laws happened in 2019. There was some more than incremental improvement, but we found where the gaps are. And I think that over time, hopefully sooner rather than later, and that's dependent on how many of you get involved in the campaign, we should be able to change this, whether it's this year with a private members bill by Jenny Kwan, or it's making sure that any future progressive party after this government needs to have this bill as part of their platform. I think we can win this. And the reason I think that is because, every time I present on one of these webinars, if you've come to a few of them, I come back to the same story, which is it took 5 to 7 years, depending on how long you were in the campaign, to stop the Energy East pipeline through updating Canada's um, climate assessment laws. So that was a long campaign fight where there were multiple legislative changes that happened over that 5 to 7 year timeline that allowed the kind of like sowed the ground for the decision that we wanted to happen in that campaign. So I'm always kind of playing the long game in this. So Jenny Kwan has developed this PMB. Not all of the original parts of the PMB that we originally submitted to her are there anymore. Some were cut on the drafting room floor. But we've got this package that, hey, maybe it's defeated now because not enough of the Liberals come along, but we can still fight for that PMB. With all of these types of measures, we're not kind of one and done, and we can hold them accountable over time to keep making progress towards these goals. And if we do get the law change, then it becomes even more clear when we fight the battle in the courts that Canada has violated the Arms Trade Treaty. So I think like the benefit to getting these specific changes in is that it removes the gray area and the ambiguity before the courts in the future. And closing the US loophole is essential to making sure that an arms embargo is strong, because Canada can, use the Special Economic Measures Act to impose an arms embargo on Israel. But if there's still a gaping US loophole, as we know, that's not sufficient. So it's a arms embargo on Israel and closing the US loophole that is kind of like the essential package together to kind of achieving our goals. And I know for many folks in the Palestinian community, like me talking about the long game feels maybe too long, but I'm just trying to be a realist about what we can achieve in a short timeline.
Why can't we ask our MP to completely sever all ties with Israel? No trade, cultural, social, academic, diplomatic association whatsoever. I think we're doing that. But
So the reason we're pushing for a bill like this is because there's only certain things that are within the power and responsibility of an MP. They can create laws, but there's no way to create a law that severs our relationship with Israel. Those are ministerial decisions that stem from what is called crown prerogative over foreign policy. So that's the reason we chose this bill, is that it's absolutely something that MPs can do, and there is limited to no ministerial prerogative that can get in the way. Whereas the arms embargo demand is fully Anita Anand and Mark Carney's decision, and we can't actually use MPs in the House to force it. I have a crying toddler beside me during a presentation, which I apologize for, but I'm going to dad and present at the same time.
since we are referring to international law as the basis of the bill, wouldn't it be a good idea to refer to Lester Pearson, a liberal who was there at the beginning of the UN and Canadian delegation, was quite active?
Yeah, you can absolutely refer to Lester Pearson in the Canada as a champion of multilateralism section. I mean, there are some other sides to the Lester Pearson story in terms of the partition of Palestine, but I think on a whole, like we can strategically use the narrative about Lester Pearson to push forward this legislation. That is kind of the direction that I was pointing you towards by bringing up those stories, and you kind of nailed it in terms of picking the image of a Canadian prime minister to use to justify the bill. So that's exactly what I was pointing to.
And just to remind everybody, the petition and the campaign link is at the chat. I do have a last question. I actually like this question. I kept it until the end. How would you best connect a critique of the Gaza Special Measures Program with the fact that Canada is essential to the F-35 jet use by Israel? That is, we have applications in limbo with no decisions for, say, more than 1.5 years. And in the meantime, we're arming Israel to rain destruction down on the Palestinian population.
I have not being kind of like glib and cynical about the answer, but I think that those two things beside each other show you the true priorities of the Canadian government. Um, I did myself write a report for CJPME on the kind of like design of the Gaza visa program. And, like the title of our report was Designed to Fail, Anti-Palestinian Racism in the Gaza visa program. And I basically said that, the way that Canada is operating right now is that it lets people who are supportive of the US security paradigm and Zionism into the country, and it tries to exclude anyone that is not pro Zionist from the country if it can. So I just think we have to understand um, the special measures program as one manifestation of how Canada supports Zionism, and then Canada's continued arming of Israel is another manifestation of how Canada continues to try and support Zionism. That's not to say that there aren't cracks forming, but those cracks are still decidedly liberal Zionists. When you look at and see like Carney's support for recognition, it is a pliable Palestinian pseudo state that is supportive of Zionism. I don't know that Carney made a mistake when he said we need a Zionist Palestinian state. I think he was being true to form when he said that, and I think that is the thread that connects these issues. What's powerful about this bill is that we have a chance to break that consensus.
That's it. I think we don't have any questions coming in. And I had that question actually. So Jenny Kwan's private members bill, I think it was number 27, right?
I
27,
think
28.
it's in the first 30. Yes.
And
So
usually,
yeah, private members bills work in groups. So all of the first 30 come up kind of together right away and they're shuffled through Parliament as a pack. And then the next 30 go. So we know Jenny Kwan's bill is going to be read for the first time sometime between late next week and early the week after.
amazing. I don't think we have any more questions. Yes, the recording will be available. We'll send out a link for it. I think there's a toolkit as well, right, Alex? There was a question on that that I answered. There will be a toolkit that will be provided for everybody who joined as well. We'll send it to all our mailing list.
Exactly.
Um, do we have any indication of support from any Liberal MPs, and how can we maximize this? This just came in.
Yeah, so I think, there are Liberal MPs who quietly asked us to do this, though when push came to shove after the election of Carney, none of them were willing to be um, the head of the snake or the cutting edge, as it were, on this. So I think, it's our job to get Liberal MPs working on this. Um, I think there's a bunch of Liberal MPs who have cultivated a network of support based on being pro-Palestinian, and kind of now is the time to ask them to pay up, essentially.
That's it. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Thank you as well for the amazing and engaging questions. Like I said, the petition and the loophole campaign is on the chat, and you can find them on our link tree. That's link tr.ee/CJPME official. It's in the bio of all our social media handles on all platforms. And like I said, we will be sharing the recording as well as a toolkit on everything that was discussed today. Thank you all very much and have a wonderful evening.